Hello, welcome to our week in review here for our unit on Buddhism, and also welcome to the inside of my garage. It's not quite as picturesque as the backyard, but it is fall, and so in honor of the cooling temperatures, I'm wearing my fancy hat from Ireland. All right, so this week we talked a lot about the different schools of Buddhism, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana. We also had a short little discussion thread on Navayana, which is probably not something that came up in the reading so much. Um, you also read a challenging article on gender and Mahayana teachings, and I could see that many of you were making direct connections between the article by Jose Cabezon and the other readings that we had this week from the textbook. So in my shout outs, which I'm going to get to right now, I'm actually going to just talk about one thing on meditation, and then the other two are for people who talked about the Cabazon article, and then we'll do a little preview, of course, for next week, because that's what we do. So Kimberly wrote about meditation and its role within Buddhism, and there was one line that she said where she mentioned that although most Buddhists do not meditate regularly anymore, they still show Buddhism spiritual progress by supporting the Buddhist causes and by supporting and applying the Buddhist principles in their daily lives. And what this made me think of is how, we have this idea, especially here in the US, I think, meditation is one of these core practices that we associate with Buddhism. And yet I have been told by people who know a lot more than me, and I've read things written by people who know a lot more than me, that in, say, countries where Buddhism is widely practiced, such as Thailand and Japan, just as examples, that meditation is actually not as big of a deal. I had one classmate a long time ago in grad school who was a former Buddhist monk, and he was American, but he had lived in Japan and resided at a monastery there. And he said, in the U.S. everyone meditates, and in Japan, no one meditates. Um, and so what that made me think of is one, this would be an area for us to kind of dig in a bit more about why that is. But also it made me think about how and this is something that several people commented on throughout the weekly thread here, that mindfulness um, as a meditation technique or technique um, what's designed to help people, feel better in all kinds of ways. And meditation is a big component of this mindfulness sort of movement that we see spreading here in the US. And then it's largely done and sort of packaged and sold and thus consumed as if it is a purely kind of secular practice. And this made me think a lot about the Encinitas court case and the discussion that we kind of had last week about yoga and the debates over whether or not it's permissible for yoga to be taught in US public schools. Similarly, we have debates, although I'm not sure about specific court cases, although I should look that up, debating whether or not mindfulness can be taught. And so one of the questions I had, and I wrote this out because I wanted to make sure I got the language right, is if we take a practice with such clear roots in different religious traditions, like here this week we're talking about meditation, and then we strip it of the elements that we deem explicitly religious, then what are we left with? Can we really pull this technique out of its cultural and religious context and still have something. Now, a lot of people would argue that yes, and that's why yoga and meditation are so easily exported and taught and taken on by people who will say, well, I can practice yoga without necessarily believing in anything to do with Hinduism. I can practice meditation without having anything to do with Buddhism. And of course, the deeper we get into the semester, we'll be able to identify contemplative practices in all of these religious traditions that look, sound, and feel an awful lot like, samadhi, meditation within Buddhism or Hinduism. So that's something else for us to think about. Also, especially before I move on here, when we talk about new religious movements in a few weeks. So next week we talk about Jainism, and then after that we get to NRMs. And during that unit on new religious movements, we will deal a bit more with these questions about how certain practices are adapted um, and adopted by other, by new communities in the last 200 years. Okay, let me scroll down here more of my notes. So I wanted to do shout outs to Kanani and Brenna for their posts on the Kabazon article. So Kanani notes that while Kabazon acknowledges Buddhism has this patriarchal bent to it, there's a lot of these feminine aspects found in the art and even in certain vocabulary terms. And then Kanani mentioned that Kabazon draws on Wittgenstein, who some of you may not be so familiar with. Um, so specifically, Wittgenstein's theory of family resemblance in order to understand gendered symbols through spiritual traditions. So that was great that Kanani highlighted that part of Cabazon's article. Now we haven't dealt too much with theory this semester. We had a few kind of basic dealings with it during the first week of the semester and in the introduction in Broad's textbook. So I wanted to share a Crash Course video. Some of you may have heard of Crash Course. It's a great series of videos. I use it in a lot of my courses. So they have an episode on language and meaning where they talk about Wittgenstein's theory of family resemblance. And also, just for fun, I'm going to post, along with this announcement, I'll post a picture I took of Wittgenstein's tombstone, which is in Cambridge, England, when I went there for a research trip a few years ago when I was working on my dissertation. And there was a manuscript that was at Cambridge, and I stayed with a friend there, and one day we kind of had a free morning. He said, "Oh, do you want to go see Wittgenstein's, grave?" And who could turn that down? Um, okay, and so then I wanted to move on to, so that was Kanani's post, and then Brenna had a detailed sort of summary of the vocabulary terms that Cabazon highlights. So Brenna said, quote, "In the scriptures of Mahayana, there are several instances where wisdom is identified as female. So females mostly represent knowledge and wisdom. Some of the feminine words that are used are prana, meaning indirect insight into truth taught by Buddha, and as a faculty required to attain enlightenment." That's right. So prana, actually, its original meaning is not the sort of active lifestyle clothing brand that you may be familiar with, but actually about attaining enlightenment. Other terms that Brenna highlighted were vidya, Sanskrit term meaning right knowledge or clarity, and then parina, meaning wisdom, intelligence, understanding. And then she went on to say that masculine terms usually refer to emotive states, compassion and love. Some words refer to emotions of love, such as preman, referring to emotions of love. So certain types of images are coded as masculine versus feminine because of how wisdom, knowledge, compassion, and love are viewed in Buddhist religion. So, Brenna, I want to thank you for the people who maybe didn't dig into the Cabazon article. This was a great little summary of an important part of his argument, which was his argument's partially based on Wittgenstein's theory of family resemblance, but also Cabazon is really digging into these terms. What do these terms mean? And so, as someone who identifies as a textualist and who therefore loves reading texts and thinking about words and what they mean and what they can possibly mean in sort of different contexts, I really enjoyed this part of Cabazon's article. Um, and I encourage all of us to think about the way we use words, what kinds of expectations we have about certain words or concepts. For a link between this piece of Cabazon's article and some things we're going to cover later in this semester, I just wanted to mention that in Greek we have this term Sophia, right? So sophos, like philosophy is a love of wisdom, or sophos there is wisdom, and Sophia then becomes a term that's used to describe this sort of divine feminine wisdom. And this is adopted in the early Christian community runs with this, but they take it from the ancient Greek tradition. And so we can discuss when we get to our unit on Christianity how they incorporate that, because again, with Christianity, similar here to Buddhism, we have traditions that are seen and are very patriarchal in their organization and in their practices, and yet we also have these very important ways in which they hold up this sense of divine femininity and link the feminine aspect to wisdom. Okay. So then, just for some concluding thoughts, next week we return to another tradition, Jainism, with deep roots in South Asia. So we've had Hinduism, now Buddhism, and now Jainism. And we'll see similar vocabulary terms there, but also some important differences. And one thing I'd really want you to focus on as you're doing the reading is the discussion of the Tirthankaras, or ford makers, which are people in the Jain tradition who are identified as having found a way across or out of this constant stream or cycle of rebirth, but and then they're passing, they are essentially creating a path that others may eventually follow. And as you're reading about it, I want you to reflect back on this particular Mahayana Buddhist teaching about the Bodhisattva, right? The Bodhisattva is the person who reaches enlightenment, but then instead of going into nirvana, returns, right? The Bodhisattva returns to earth. They have achieved that. And the Buddha is the enlightened one or the awakened one. The Bodhisattva is also enlightened or awakened. And so, but then they use that in this exercise of extreme compassion to deny themselves that release from samsara so that they may serve others. So as we're learning here about the Tirthankaras, I'd like us to think about how, as an idea or a conceptualization of an idealized person, how these two are different, the Bodhisattva and the Tirthankara. Lastly, I posted an announcement last night about this talk that UCCS is hosting with Cornell West on October 15th. So please attend, of course, via Zoom, or maybe, no, I think it'll be on YouTube. If you can, Professor West is an amazing speaker. He is a real leading public intellectual. He kind of has this like pop culture icon status in certain circles, which is part of the reason that he had a role in the last two of the Matrix movies. If you've seen those from now, I guess quite a long time ago. But it's really great that UCS is hosting him, and the fact that he's giving a talk and speaking on a panel where they're going to be talking about race, religion, and then race, religion, and politics in a year of global calamity. And so I think it'll be kind of a step up or a continuation of what we were talking about with the panel on race and religion. That was from a few weeks ago that I know a few of you were able to attend. And so this will be another wonderful event to really dig into those themes. So that's it for this week. Thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing your posts on Jainism this coming week. Take care.